Good afternoon. I'm Gil Morer, and we're about to embark on a wide-ranging discussion with one of the world's best-known architects, Lord Norman Foster. Vertical cities represent a vision for our urban environments, where skyscrapers are reimagined as holistic communities that contribute to the vibrancy and ecological balance of our cities. Hearst Tower is a shining example that debuted in 2006. This amazing diagrid structure not only signifies Foster and Partners' introduction by Hearst to the American scene, but has also made a lasting impact as sustainable architecture. Hearst Tower's contribution to eco-friendly design is highlighted for being the first to receive the Gold LEED certification for New York City, covering both its core and its interiors. Subsequently, we advanced that to a Platinum LEED status, which reinforces its green ethos. Hearst Tower stands today as a symbol of tenacity and forward-thinking, prevailing throughout the aftermath of 9/11 and charting a hopeful path beyond the pandemic. In creating the tower, the collaborative work was a demonstration of our shared desire to advance the boldness of human aspiration with ecological responsibility. I know today's conversation with Norman and Frank will be as enriching for you as it will be for us here at Hearst.
Please welcome Frank Bennack and Lord Norman Foster.
Well, that was a friendly voice. We couldn't do this without some involvement by Gil. He's down in Miami, or actually not in Miami, in Palm Beach. And it was important that he be a part of this. He would, of course, be here. Welcome to all of you for this conversation with Lord Foster. I hope neither you nor he minds if I call him Norman from here on. It would be like calling my wife Mrs. Bennack, given our long relationship. But we plan to talk about a wide range of subjects here today. It's a Q&A in a way, but I hope it's more of a conversation. And Gil said it very well. It's his visionary philosophy of vertical cities and the future of sustainable design is what we'll be talking about. And at the end, we'll be taking your questions. So let's dig in right away. Norman, there are two quotes that I am very fond of that relate to all this. The first one is yours. The skyscraper is emblematic of the modern age city and a reminder that the city is arguably civilization's greatest invention. I think that's a powerful quote, an appropriate one for today. Now, you know, most quotes either come from Yogi Berra or Confucius. So we're not certain about the next one. I think actually maybe it was Paul Goldberger or maybe it was Gil taking off of something that Paul had said, but I like it anyway. It's Hearst Tower with its feet in the past and its head in the future. Norman's Tower proves architecture can be an agent of change. I like that, and I think that fits us. You know, you and I were comparing notes. Gil mentioned 2006. Actually, that was the official opening, but goes back longer than that, obviously, and important. But 18 years ago, we opened officially what was actually intended to be the fulfillment of the vision that William Randolph Hearst had had 80 years before with, of course, his architect, Joseph Urban, for whom this theater is named. Incidentally, we can afford more heat, and I know it's a little chilly in here. Ordinarily, I would blame my wife for that because that's an ongoing battle, but hopefully it'll warm up a little bit on the way. But in any event, we think that this tower came at a time when New York needed it, that it made a powerful impression that lives until today. And we'll be talking a little bit more about that history in a minute, but first the question. Looking back that 20 years, Norman, how do you view the impact of this place and what you did, and today including the influence that this place may have had on other projects? Did it influence anything that you did after that?
Hugely, yes. I mean, it was the first here in many ways, as you said. It was the first exercise in sustainability. So in that sense, it was a progressive fringe. You and Gil and your colleagues encourage the idea of sustainability. You supported it. That's now mainstream. We take it for granted, but it was really at that time pioneering. And also the idea of a diagrid. We'd never done that before as a practice. We'd done numerous high-rise buildings. Why a diagrid? Well, first of all, it was doing more with less. There's more load paths, so it's more resilient. But it was a 20% saving in the weight of steel, so it was more economic. 2,000 tons, and 85% of that recycled. But if the architecture was the expression of the structure, it was also the identity. And it's still quite interesting. In that sense, it wasn't trying to be different for the sake of being different. It was being different to have a higher performance and to have a sense of identity. So I think that, and if I thought a bit more about the integrity of a structure and its values, I think in many ways it mirrored the values of Hearst, and it echoed right back to that conception in the 1920s and the 28 base. And it's still the only historic marriage of a contemporary tower with a historic base.
Yes.
So,
and the only overbuild of a landmark in this city. I think one other had been approved but wasn't completed. And of course, a lot of that had to do, one of the things, if you didn't know this, the world's greatest architects are also the world's greatest salesmen. And and if I could put him on the street selling advertising, that would happen by tomorrow afternoon. I have a poignant story that relates to this place. Sometime early in 2011, I got a call from Steve Jobs. And Steve said, "Frank, I'm absolutely every day begging my doctor to let me come and see your building." He, of course, was planning and talking with you and your partners about that huge project that ultimately eventuated. He said, if I can make one visit, one trip, it's going to be to see the Hearst Tower. And of course, I welcomed him warmly and told him how we would roll out the red carpet. Well, he never came. In September of that year, he passed away. But I've always remembered that story as somehow one of many things that punctuate the experience that we all enjoyed here together. Changing pace, on September 11th, 2001, that day in infamy, 9/11, you and I and Gil Mora and others of our colleagues were in my conference room planning what was to be the board meeting the next day to determine going forward with this project. Instead, we watched the towers come down. Talk about that. That's a day that we can never forget. First of all, I know about you, Norman, but I wasn't sure as that happened that we or anybody else that day was going to build a high-rise.
it was even prophesied as the death of the tower. It's easy to forget that.
Yeah.
I think there are certain points in one's life or history where you always know where you are. I mean, I remember being in a cinema queue in Tottenham Court Road when I heard about the assassination of Kennedy. And in a way, being here, I remember being in a side street, sitting in a truck, hearing the events unfold, and then we ended up together in the boardroom. But the almost immediate aftermath of that was an extraordinary exercise, I think, in leadership, inspiration, and example. Within a month, you went public that this tower was going to happen. And I remember with Mike Bloomberg, the groundbreaking.
Right.
So it was an incredible act of confidence. It was about leadership, all the good values, which were in stark contrast to the events that we witnessed that day.
Well, we're very proud of having been the first after 9/11. And we said, this is an adult crowd. Those bastards are not going to change our commitment to this company, to this city, to this nation. And we were going to go ahead. And we did. Now, I will tell you that some of our senior people said to me, I'm voting for this, but I want to be on the second floor. You know, one of the things that brought us to you, I remember visiting you and you're showing us around, and I remember the improvements at the British Museum. And one of the things we had in mind, because we had this landmark building that could not come down, and so therefore your experience with making things that already exist work, as you did there. And what were you thinking when you looked at this, when you first were asked, what are you going to do here, Norman?
It was interesting. The very first thoughts were, how do you turn this historic base to advantage? Because everybody saw it as a negative, because the floor to ceiling of an office building in the 20s, very, very different from the needs of today, where you need heavy servicing. Right. So the assumption was it was going to be substandard office accommodation. But if you look at the challenge, how do you bring the sidewalk back to life, which is the very essence of the traditional city? Life at the sidewalk, stores. And then how do you turn this historic shell, this base, to advantage? And I remember thinking that if the base was where all the heavy stuff wanted to go up and down for the restaurant, cafes, could this be the equivalent of the town square, the village square? Could you have the equivalent of the townhouses above? Because remember that Hearst was 10 different locations at that time, and each location was its own little empire, its own identity. So I think there was initially an apprehension about going into a collective building. Would everybody lose that sense of identity? And I think that the idea of hollowing out the base as the town square, you know what the immediate reaction was? You can't do that in New York. That's called facadism. So in a way, doing what we did was also to challenge convention. But I remember also the meetings with landmarks, and interestingly, the impression that I got they were going to be difficult. The reality was that that sharing the challenges of how you place a 20th, 21st century tower on top of a early 20th century base, we had the best minds in landmarks, and also the other review bodies. And so I think that the leadership that was shown by Hearst, by you, your colleagues, by the city, by Mayor Bloomberg, spread throughout the whole infrastructure of the kind of civic government of New York. So there was a shared will.
More than that, there was a shared excitement, as it turned out. Part of that, of course, was the presentation you made, and I think it's still the fact that we had a unanimous approval of the landmarks.
I remember saying, I think it was Sandy Lindbaum,
Right.
who was the
Attorney.
lawyer, the attorney.
Yeah.
And we were in landmarks in City Hall, and I leant across and said, how's it going? Do you think it's all right? And he said something like, they've never applauded ever in the history of it's all right, he said.
Well, they were hungry, but what you offered up was what you offered up was amazing. And we thought, incidentally, that those first 6 floors would have to be office space, that we couldn't get the FAR up above, that we couldn't get the additional space in the tower. But that was the great victory, was being able to do that and then not sacrifice the amount of office space that we had. And what a different building this would be if we had those old 6 floors and whatever might have been on top of them. Also, you brought to us, Norman, I'll be honest, none of us really had thought in terms of the LEEDs designation. You taught us what that meant. And I hope you recall that we never said no when you said, this is what we need to do to
Well,
get
you were
there.
encouraging.
But talk about that a little bit, because that was a new concept, and this was the first tower to get that designation.
It was the first tower to get a gold designation.
Right, right.
And then 6 years later, when I think the accounting of the energy use of the building became shared with the LEED authorities, they then created a higher category, which was LEED Platinum. So it went from a gold to a standard which hadn't been established then. Regarding your remarks about it being a little chilly in here, I hesitate to share one aspect of the environmental issue, and that is that for 75% of the year, as you'll read in the statistics, you can work with the outside air temperature. I think that's been taken a little too literally today. But the consequence is that there is, not surprisingly, an energy saving. And so compared with a code-compliant equivalent, this is consuming something like 26% less energy. And everything is working kind of synergetically. So the roof harvests rainwater, reduces the amount of water that's deposited in the sewers by something like 20%. That's fed into the waterfall, the so-called ice fall of Jamie Carpenter, which is part of the art installation of the building with the Richard Long above. And that's working to also condition that central space. So it's a early holistic view of how you look at energy, and also it's a healthier building because it's not going to the minimum code standards. It's moving more fresh air through the building.
The water feature was one of the more difficult ones, as you remember. We had a variety of things that we went everywhere to look at until we finally decided on that one. And one director said to me, "You mean we're going to pay money to have somebody put mud on our wall?" Which we did. Great, great piece. Now let's go. Enough about us, as they say. Let's talk about the vertical cities. You're a pioneer of that concept, obviously, and we have a wonderful exhibit upstairs that hopefully you're going to see. But talk a little bit about your perspective on that and how you come to grips with the multiple uses of the vertical city, which, as you've already established in the quote that I used earlier, that you think is the most important thing that happened to society.
There's been a recent research study by two Berkeley-based researchers, and one outcome of that is a map of the East Coast here. And the colors of that map go around red through yellow, through oranges, eventually to dark green. And there's a graph. The dark green is the minimum carbon footprint, and the reds and the yellows are the maximum. So you look at this map of the East Coast prepared by these researchers based on household receipts. And there's a dark green blob, and it's Manhattan. It's here. And that's the lowest carbon imprint. So that's my latest weapon when I'm always kind of attacked. How can a tall tower be sustainable? I'm challenged. And if you look at that map, it's telling you that New York is a compact city. It's walkable, pedestrian-friendly, public transport, accessible, mixed use. It's everything which is the sustainable city. And that's made possible by tall buildings, by density. And that's the opposite of the car-borne city, where you can't walk anywhere, where you have to get in a car.
Los Angeles.
Which sprawls,
Yeah.
yes. I mean, I think that, well, it's better I don't get onto that. But
I can,
but
though.
so you know, and it's roughly a 2-to-1. I mean, it's not quite that, but the energy consumption of Manhattan compared with your sprawling, car-borne, never-ending suburban metropolis, and that is a reality for much of urbanization, and that needs to be addressed. And the unbuilt cities, of which there are many still to come, when the planet enlarges by another 2 billion in the next 26 years. So what model is held up? And interestingly, what is good for the planet in terms of energy consumption is also where people want to be. So if you look at those cities which are voted for in terms of the best places to visit, the best places to live, they're all the compact city on three continents, and there are many, many different surveys of that. So there is a synergy there.
Is there a conflict between the needs and the interest of people who reside there and the towers in which people work?
No, I think there's a synergy between being able to walk to a neighborhood store, to be able to get a coffee, to be able to walk to school or to the workplace. I'm not suggesting that's universal, but proximity and public transport all comes together to make a city which is friendly, accessible, desirable, and sustainable.
Well, I'm reminded, I'm smiling because someone who also was a part of our team then, Vic Gansey, used to say you never want to live over a restaurant because of the kitchens. I don't know that I've ever lived over a restaurant, but...
You just hope it's got good extracts. Going to the top.
Yes, yes. One of the most important projects ever that you're engaged in now, which is the new J.P. Morgan headquarters at 270 Park. I told Norman for the first time that he knew that for 23 years as a board member of J.P. Morgan and all of its predecessors from manufacturers Hanover through Chemical through Chase, I went to that building. And so after this one, that's the closest to my heart. So talk about it.
Well, it replaces a very prestigious earlier building. And if you talk about the importance of using the resources of land, of site, responsibly, then it now concentrates 4 times on that same site, 4 times the population of the original building. The original building was 3,500. We're now talking about 14,000.
Right.
But the design of the structure, which cantilevers outwards, ensures that there is 2.5 times the amount of public space at the base of the building, and some of it garden space. So the increase in the public domain is quite dramatic. It is the first, the largest all-electric building. There's no operational carbon emissions, so it's using totally renewable energy. It's also developing a lot of the ideas that were latent here, that were explored here, and taking them further. So it's moving twice the code volume of air, so it's a healthier building. And it's got a very rich mix of social activities. So it's very much, again, building on the spirit of this building where, like this, the social spaces, and totally questioning the conventional concept of a tower. Conventionally, a tower has always had a central core, which is part of the structure. So you get a ribbon of space around it. And the core is about the escape stairs, the elevators, the utilities. But if you had that, you couldn't have what we have at the base of this building because you have a big void. Yeah. So it reinterprets, puts the core really to the side. So J.P. Morgan is, in terms of its scale, I mean, it's 60 stories, 1,400 foot high.
Second highest building in New York.
Yes, yes. And again, the structure, the diagonal bracing is reducing the amount of steel, in that case, by some 10%. It's a bronze-clad building. It's a very noble metal. It's about weathering over time. So it's all of these projects are about evolving in this case, the tall building. There's one point I would make, in going back to the earlier question about the sustainable walkable city. It doesn't necessarily have to be high rise. So a more European style, and that could be European style as in Boston or San Francisco, or London or Paris, is medium rise, but it's still in relative terms high density, not as high density as New York or Hong Kong, which are predominantly high rise. But so the compact model is quite wide in its interpretation.
I was recently in Reykjavik, and I was surprised at how total absence of really tall towers. And there didn't appear to be a lot of single family. Seems like people were living in multi-family buildings, but they were not large, but they had the characteristics that you're describing. Part of what inspired our doing this, of course, is you had this recent exhibit at Centre Pompidou in Paris. Talk about that. Talk about the background for that and what it stated. And of course, we're exhibiting some pieces of that here today, but that had to be an exciting thing for you and an important expression of the vertical city.
Yes, I mean, the models which are here on exhibition in Pompidou, we opened up the gallery to the skyline of Paris and arrayed all the vertical buildings so they played against the skyline. But I think that Pompidou, what was interesting about Pompidou was several different dimensions. I'd say that seeing in one place 6 decades of practice, from the very earliest projects in practice going back to the early 1960s right up to the present, you could see that there was a continuity of philosophy, that the roots of the practice were very much in sustainability. It wasn't called sustainability at that time, so it was efforts to reduce the amount of energy, to recycle, to encourage sunlight, natural ventilation, views. Interestingly, the big shift from going back to the 1960s, that was subjective. We felt strongly and intuitively that that would be good for your health. The reality now is that that's been scientifically proven. So, a patient recovering from surgery in a hospital in a room with a view will leave hospital earlier than somebody whose room doesn't have a view. So, and the Harvard School of Public Health has been, amongst others, their researchers have proved that green buildings really improve your performance, make you happier, healthier, and so on. I think the exhibition, so in many ways it demonstrated a continuity. It was also an opportunity to be able to share with the public at large the importance of collaboration. So at the entrance there were the names of those who'd contributed to the exhibition. So there were 10,000 names, making the point obvious to those who practice architecture or urbanism that it really is a team activity. And then the director of Pompidou, Laurent Lebon, who was aware of an exhibition that I'd curated and which the foundation had designed in Guggenheim Bilbao, was called Autos, Art and Architecture. And it was showing the links between urbanism, architecture, painting, sculpture, everyday objects, cars, aircraft, the commonality of design. So he was insistent on the opportunity to be able to weave into that exhibition works by artists like Sol LeWitt. So Sol LeWitt had a skeletal sculpture which was next to a skeleton of the structure of J.P. Morgan, next to the model showing how it looked. And it was also interesting to discover that the artist Sol LeWitt, who one of our heroes, was in his early career, he worked for I.M. Pei as an architect before he became, and his work was hugely influenced by the New York grid. And I would go right back and say, this building is about the roots of New York in the same way that J.P. Morgan is. Right. It's really respecting the origins of of New York, of Manhattan, which is this incredible grid with its setbacks and its geometry. So in a way it was, as one critic said, I referred to it as a retrospective, and he said, no, it's not a retrospective, because what you're all doing is about the future. You should call it a futurespective. And this building is about the future.
Yeah. Yeah, I came to realize that architecture is so important to life, partly through our relationship, but through the other things that I've done in this city. It makes all the difference in the world. I remember the early days when we first opened the building. Our managers would say, people come earlier, they stay later, and they dress better than they had in the old 959, as we, those of us who've been around a while, refer to it. So I think that there's no question that your hospital example, you know, one of the things that interests me is how you, because you have done work in stadiums, in bridges, in airports, along, of course, with the high-rise buildings we've talked about. How do you adapt from one to the other, or is there a continuity of thought there, that principles that apply in each and every case?
I'd say that there are shared principles, but there is consciously not a one-size-fits-all. There isn't a, perhaps the recognizable style is a total absence of style, because no two enterprises, organizations, cultural institutions, those who commission the patrons of architecture, they're all different, and the sites are different. The things that you can measure are different, but also the things that you cannot necessarily measure, that you don't see above the surface, the values that might lie under that. They might be feng shui in some Asian societies. So I would say that it starts with research, and it has a very strong social agenda, and that hopefully ensures that that the design response is sensitive to the context and feels of the place, and gives something back. If it's a building in a city, if it's a private building, it gives something back in terms of the public domain, whatever that is.
Because it would seem to a layman that there's something very dramatically different about that bridge, which I remember so well. Everybody here has a responsibility that on occasion keeps them awake at night. What, if anything, keeps you awake at night, Norman?
Worrying about the project that I'm working on. Or turning it over in my mind, and so I think I'd like to think it was a form of healthy obsession.
Yeah, well,
even if it deprives me of sleep at times.
well, we all have some of those nights. You've worked with a lot of other famous architects like Buckminster Fuller and Jean Nouvel and Anish Kapoor. I know they learned something from you. How did you choose them, and did you learn from them?
Buckminster Fuller and Otto Eicher. I mean, it's quite interesting that that Bucky was very much known for his domes, his Dymaxion structures, and Otto, very much known for his work on the Munich Olympics, the way in which he invented the symbolic figures, created a typeface known as Rotis. But predominantly these individuals, in my recall, were much more about philosophy, about a way of thinking. And I think perhaps it triggers an awareness that there really is no such thing as originality, that everybody, and I can't think of any exceptions in any field whatsoever, whether it's surgery, whether it's urbanism, architecture, design, we all build on the work of others. Now, we may interpret that in a way that makes it different, but it doesn't make it necessarily original. It makes it different because that interpretation is built. Those influences can be absolutely conscious, or they can be buried, they can be subconscious. But in that sense, but coming back to the role of the artist, I would say that whether it's in this building, whether it's the Reichstag, where I work with the artists in their studios, or personal projects for a family where we've involved an artist, the result has always been magnified. In other words, the combination of talent, which I guess also brings me back to the roots of the practice, which eventually went on to create this building and others. It's the feeling that architecture is too important to be left to architects alone, that you really need all the skills, because buildings are about all the senses. And perhaps one of the formative points for me was in Yale, the master's course. Paul Rudolph was the dean. He drove the school. And we had an assignment of a tall building, and I said to Rudolph, I don't know anything about tall buildings. I need to work with an engineer so I can know more about them. And Rudolph was very much the cult of the architect is the master. And in that approach, you design a building as an architect, and then you give it to the engineers, and they make it work. They make it stand up. They make it, hot when it's cold outside, and so on. And this was, for me, I wanted curiosity. I had a thirst for what makes a building tick, and that was a changing career point. Working alongside an engineer, I felt empowered as a designer. I had more knowledge, and I'd say that's been a guiding principle. Not the idea of designing by committee. That's kind of plain vanilla grey. But the idea that as designers, you can more responsibly lead if you have more information, more knowledge of what makes that building tick. So you bring those skills right at the beginning, right. Not kind of, pass the parcel later.
I'm reminded that those of us in the room with you on that fateful 9/11 expected those towers to fall over. And I remember using your engineering skills and telling us, no, it's going to get heated down below and fall down on itself. It's a horrible scene that we saw that day. Incidentally, for a media guy, I've had more experience with architects than you would expect. I work with Philip Johnson on doing what is now called the Paley Center, where I'm the chairman, was the Museum of Television and Radio. Richard Meyer in building a similar building there, and Liz Diller in the redevelopment of Lincoln Center. And one of the things that I come away with, and you've been most important in that thought process, and that is that in working with great artists, whether they're architects or not, there is a totally untrue concept that they're difficult, and that it's hard to get done what you want done because of their strong views. It's hogwash. It's absolute hogwash. All of these, but you in particular. We had 100 meetings when we built this building. I mean, if you remember, we were constantly. And I remember let's do a better light here than we have planned in the original, or let's do a different wood here than we planned in the original. And we loved it. We loved it. It was a great, great experience. And
my first experience with Philip Johnson is perhaps a story that I've told on more than one occasion, so many perhaps in the audience are aware of it. But I did as a student in the master's class, I did a joint project with Richard. That was unheard of. You didn't combine.
we didn't do that.
So it was also pushing the limits of what Rudolph as the dean. And we did this project for a laboratory complex on a university site in part of Yale. And it was a spine with ziggurats either side. And at a certain point in the evolution of this design, Richard and I decided that along this spine, which was all about connectivity, we would add at intervals recreation spaces, coffee shops, and so on. And Rudolph didn't like this. He said, no, the spine is absolutely pure, you shouldn't do this. And Richard and I think, were rather pig-headed, and we pressed on with this. And it came to the final jury, and the juries at Yale were like the bear pit, and the students would gather because they became, they had a sacrificial element to them. And so there was kind of a lot of tension built up, and Philip was one of the external critics. And at a certain point, he looked at this and said, these things along the spine, I mean, they compromise it. And Rudolph said, I've been telling them all along, and they don't listen. and Philip said, you know what? And he ripped the things off the model and threw them to the assorted crowd and said, there, now it looks better. And of course, he was right.
Well, I think I'm sure Gil or I have told you that for probably a decade, we had a model in my office as we aspired to have a new building. Happened to have been done by Kevin Roach, who did not ultimately do this great tower, you did. But we looked at it every day, and we said, when are we going to do that? But we agreed we had to build a company first. And when you build a company, then you have this wonderful headquarters. On a much livelier and informal note, I know that you don't ever plan to quit, which is something I can identify with.
We're almost contemporaries.
But what do you do when and if there's any spare time? You should know that he is a world-class skier, and he's a pilot. He was in the Royal Air Force. And as a matter of fact, when we went to do our review in Europe, he flew us to Berlin to see the Reichstag. I never imagined that the guy we were going to hire as the architect was going to fly us to Berlin.
The chauffeur.
But if you have any spare time, what do you do with it?
I cross-country ski in the winter. So I just did my 27th cross-country ski marathon 2 weeks ago. And I bike in the summer, and I run after Elena, destined never to catch up. So, so my family's makes it all possible.
Well, you're being too modest. I'm fully aware that you do a lot of humanitarian and pro bono things. And
we have a foundation. We have in Madrid, American Friends of the Foundation here in America, and the London base. But the global headquarters is in Madrid. So right now, it has a university course for based in the foundation, has students from 23 countries. immersed in issues of the city, because that's the key to climate change. It's the key to many things. So future of our society as a city is to identify, to train the civic leaders of the future. Already through the foundation workshop program, we have an architect turned politician who's the mayor in a city in Chile, who leads a consortium of mayors on conservation. We have a project division, and just to give one example, we followed through on a workshop on refugees. The group of 10 students with 10 mentors, advised by the experts directly from the United Nations, discovered that the average stay of a refugee family in a camp is something like 17 years, and they're issued with a tent. So the students were saying, couldn't you do something very, very fast that would be more durable? Out of that came a demonstration pavilion in the Venice Biennale last year that was a response to the tent, proposed a more elegant solution, which everybody loved. Anybody who saw it said, I'd love to spend a night in that. Yeah. I'd love one in my garden. And that has attracted the attention of one government. And so right now we're on course to be able to deliver at scale a permanent dwelling with kitchen, living room, 2 bedrooms, porch for $16,000, which can be built. And I could describe the technology. It's quite interesting. It's a canvas which is impregnated with low carbon cement. You drape it over a formwork, you spray it with water. Within a few hours it's rigid. Within 24 hours it's structurally integral. You can line that, you can flat pack the interior and so on. So it's using new technology. It's doing the things that with the generosity of those who've sponsored the programs of the foundation and the institute, doing the things that it's impossible for a practice to do. And it's not by many practitioners seen as, that's not architecture. But if architecture is about improving the quality of life, then it's the very essence of architecture.
I was very taken by your comment earlier that there's nothing new under the sun, where this is a creative company, as you know, and it's true. We would like to think that we have invented something, but if we can make it better, if we can give it a different approach, a different touch, then we've done our job. Incidentally, I hope you all like purple. Between Norman and
no
me.
prior consultation.
Yes. We got time for just a couple of questions. Let me see if someone would like to ask something we haven't asked. I think I see a hand back there. Is there a Is there a microphone back there?
I've lived in Sheffield for 100 years, so I watch every inch of this go up. And because I'm in the neighborhood all the time, if I had
You start again, if you would.
I've lived in Sheffield for 100 years.
Okay.
So I've watched every inch go up. And if I had, and I'm in the neighborhood all the time, so if I had $1 for every time I was standing on 57th and 8th and watching a group of people at the light, tourists, families, everybody, stop, look up, and I hear them and they go, what is that building? And they, or almost always, I watch. They cross the street and they walk by. And I just think that's kind of the highest praise when it's not, because it's so distinctive. People want to know what it is and they want to see it. And I personally think that working in it is as wonderful as looking at it. And I was just curious, with the way lifestyles evolve and stuff, in hindsight, is there any little detail or major thing that maybe you would have changed, or I should have done it differently, or I shouldn't have done that, or, I mean, I think it's perfect, but I'm a layman, so I'm just curious what you think.
Well, I think it's perfect, but
I'm not going to argue.
that's a hard. we're going to consider that a very useful narrative, as contrasted, because it's true. Anybody that has been around here as long as I have and know what this street used to be like before, and see the people passing by. Any other questions? Here's one over here, if we can get a microphone to them.
Thanks so much for coming today, Lord Foster. I think it's interesting that we began the conversation 20 years ago when people were predicting the death of the skyscraper. Now we're having a similar conversation about the future of the office. I wouldn't say the death of the office, but perhaps the evolution. And I was curious if you could offer your thoughts on the future of commercial buildings today.
You know, of course, that hits on a huge subject in American society, and that is, out of the pandemic came a habit that has been extended of people coming to the office less frequently and working from their homes. And of course, those homes can be the high rises, but I don't know how much you'd like to say about that, but it's a matter of concern with many as to whether all of these wonderful office towers are going to be filled with people of high productivity in the manner that we believe has been the case.
I think that the crises that hit cities historically, that they magnify trends that were latent, they exaggerate trends that were below the surface or surfacing. So I think that many of the workplace projects, and this is one, but if I go back to the 1970s, a building called Willis Faber, which had Olympic swimming pool, roof gardens, landscaping, flexi time ahead of its time. All of these were buildings where the workplace was about the lifestyle. So the social agenda was very, very strong. And I think that those buildings were fringe buildings. But the future of the workplace and those kind of buildings where people are attracted to return to after a pandemic are very much about a sense of community. They're going beyond the actual utilitarian essence of work. So, the buildings which represent the past, I think, will obsolesce earlier. That doesn't mean to say that they don't have a valid life. I think that the workplace of the past was the traditional central core building that recirculated refrigerated air, wasn't the healthiest kind of buildings, but was locked into concepts from the past. Those kind of buildings are eminently recyclable as residential buildings and could arguably bring a lot of the workforce of essential workers, those people who man the hospitals, the first responders, the fire brigade, the police, could bring them back into the heart of the cities because they can't work from home. You can't run a hospital sitting in your apartment. Can't run. I mean, I think that the future of those buildings, which were more than just the workplace, is assured, and that's why they're under construction now.
And I think
It's about quality.
yeah, we don't know the end game there, but what we do know is that it probably never is exactly the same as it was, which is true of everything in life. Lord Foster.
Well, I mean, it was a cholera epidemic in the middle of the 19th century that brought the reservoir, the clean water of Central Park. It was the cholera in the middle of the 19th century that cleaned up the Thames, that brought the embankment, modern sanitation. Now, that's not to say these things wouldn't have happened anyway, but it's accelerated those trends. And I think that the balance between, for those who are privileged to be able to do part of the work at home, but the desirable workplace. I mean, we are social animals. We don't need to be here together. We can all be at a screen, but we come together in restaurants. We come together for gatherings like this. So I think we're social animals, and that's why the city, its future is assured.
We have 15 seconds to say thank you, Lord. Wait, we got one more question.
One more question. You say architects are good salespeople, but they have to be good managers to be able to run such big operations. How do you do this? How do you make, it's really partners in Norman as opposed to Norman's partners. I mean, like, how does it work?
That's why I said there were 10,000 names at the beginning of that exhibition. So it's about teamwork. It's about sharing responsibility. It's about backing judgments. It's about delegation. It's about sharing. It's about, that's why Hearst, as a corporation, has prospered since 1928, and the vision of a part of New York which would be about culture and communication has taken a little while to happen, but here it is.
Anyone who thinks he can do it or she can do it alone will be very lonely in life. Thank you, Norman.